They told her no weapons on the bridge, so Mira Solis used the captain's own horns instead. When the pirate frigate's hull breach alarms howled through the diplomatic cruiser Kindred Prospect, Captain Thex'ral was already raising all four hands in surrender. The Corvathi captain's ceremonial horns, carved obsidian spirals that marked his rank, gleamed under the bridge's amber lights as he lowered his crested head in deference. 30 raiders poured through the airlock in their patchwork armor, plasma cutters hissing, voices crackling over corrupted comms. The human envoy sitting quietly at the navigation console didn't move. She just exhaled once, slow and steady, and looked at the captain. Then she stood, reached across his trembling shoulders, and snapped both horns clean off his skull with a sound like breaking stone. What happened next took 53 seconds.
Mira Solis had been on the Kindred Prospect for 11 days, and she still hadn't gotten used to the way Captain Thex'ral clicked his claws when he was nervous. It was a soft sound, like rainfall on tin, and it happened every time the ship passed through a contested corridor. Today was no different. They were 3 days out from the Coalition Summit on Vena 4, a diplomatic meeting meant to solidify trade routes between human-held systems and the Corvathi Confederacy. Mira was there as an observer, a title that meant she had no authority, no vote, and no weapons. She sat at the navigation console, a borrowed station tucked into the corner of the bridge, and watched the starfield scroll past. The Kindred Prospect was a sleek vessel, its hull plated an iridescent chitin analog that shifted colors depending on the angle of light. It was beautiful in the way old cathedrals were beautiful, deliberate, reverent, and wholly impractical for combat. The bridge was wide and circular, with low railings and no blast doors. Everything was open, visible, designed for ceremony rather than defense. Thex'ral stood at the center, his forearms folded across his chest in the Corvathi gesture of contemplation. His horns, those obsidian spirals, caught the light every time he turned his head. They were longer than Mira's forearm, polished to a mirror shine, and marked with inlaid silver script that denoted his bloodline and rank. He wore them with the same gravity a priest might wear a collar. "Envoy Solis," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the deck. "Do you find our route acceptable?" Mira glanced at the readout. They were skirting the edge of the Keth expanse, a region known for erratic gravitational eddies and, more recently, pirate activity. She'd flagged it in her report 2 days ago. Thex'ral had dismissed it with a wave of one hand, citing coalition patrols and safe passage guarantees. "It's your ship, Captain," Mira said. She kept her tone light, but her fingers tapped once against the console's edge, a nervous habit she'd never quite broken. Thex'ral clicked his claws again. "The patrols are reliable. We have nothing to fear." Mira didn't answer. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the best translation. The bridge crew moved around them in practiced rhythm. 3 Corvathi navigators, a human communications officer named Darren, and a Savathi engineer who spent most of her time muttering at the life support readouts. The ship hummed with a low, organic frequency, like a sleeping animal. Mira let herself relax, just a little. She'd been tense since boarding, her body still adjusting to the lower gravity and recycled air. She missed the weight of her old service pistol, the one she'd carried for 6 years in the outer Colonies peacekeeping force. But the summit had strict rules, no weapons on diplomatic vessels. She'd handed it over at the spaceport on Luna 9, along with her combat knife and the collapsible baton she'd kept in her boot. She flexed her fingers against the console. They felt empty. "Captain," Darren said suddenly, his voice sharp, "I'm picking up a distress signal. 3 light minutes off our starboard bow." Thex'ral swiveled. "Origin. Freighter. Coalition Registry. They're reporting a hull breach and requesting immediate assistance." Mira's chest tightened. She stood, moving to the edge of the console. "Captain, we should verify that signal before we respond." Thex'ral looked at her, his amber eyes unreadable. "Verify. It's a common tactic. Pirates fake distress calls to lure in rescue ships. They hit you when you're slowing down to dock. Thex'ral clicked his claws once, twice. The Coalition would not allow such deception in a patrolled zone. The Coalition's patrols are spread thin, and the Keth Expanse has 23 documented pirate cells operating in the last quarter alone. Darren glanced between them, his hands hovering over the comms panel. "Captain?" Thex'ral straightened, his horns catching the light. "We are a diplomatic vessel. We do not turn away from those in need." He gestured to Darren. "Acknowledge the signal. Plot an intercept course." Mira's jaw tightened. She wanted to argue, to pull up the tactical reports she'd memorized before boarding, but she knew it wouldn't matter. Thex'ral wasn't a soldier. He was a diplomat, raised in a culture that valued honor and obligation above caution. Refusing a distress call would be unthinkable to him. She sat back down, her fingers drumming against her knee. The Kindred Prospect banked smoothly, its hull plates shifting to a deeper blue as the engines adjusted. The distress signal grew stronger, a rhythmic pulse that filled the bridge's audio feed. Mira watched the readouts, her pulse steady but alert. She counted the seconds in her head, a habit from her peacekeeping days. 30 seconds to intercept, 60 seconds to visual confirmation, 90 seconds to docking range. At 87 seconds, the freighter exploded. It wasn't a violent detonation, just a sudden flare of light and debris that scattered across the viewport. The Kindred Prospect shuddered as the shockwave hit, alarms shrieking across the bridge. Thex'ral stumbled, catching himself on the railing. Mira was already moving, her hand slamming the emergency lockdown override on the console. "Brace!" she shouted, but it was too late. The pirate frigate hit them from below, its hull cutting through the Kindred Prospect's ventral plating like a knife through cloth. The ship lurched, gravity compensators failing for half a heartbeat before snapping back online. Mira hit the deck hard, her shoulder slamming into the console's edge. She tasted blood, bit her tongue, and shoved herself upright. The bridge lights flickered, then steadied. The alarms were still screaming, but beneath them Mira could hear something worse, the hiss of an airlock breach and the metallic clang of boots on deck plating. They were boarding. Thex'ral stood frozen at the center of the bridge, all four hands raised in the Korvathi gesture of surrender. His horns gleamed under the emergency lighting, his amber eyes wide with something Mira couldn't name. Not fear exactly, resignation. The raiders came through the airlock in a flood. 30 of them, maybe more, their armor mismatched and their weapons crude but functional. Plasma cutters, ballistic rifles, a few jury-rigged energy weapons that crackled with unstable charge. They moved like a pack, spreading across the bridge in practiced formation. One of them, a tall figure in a helmet with a cracked visor, leveled a rifle at Thex'ral's head. "Nobody moves," the raider said, his voice distorted through the helmet speaker. "You move, you die." Mira stayed where she was, crouched by the console. Her mind was already calculating. 30 raiders, 6 crew members, no weapons, no backup. The odds were impossible. The smart play was to comply, to wait for rescue or ransom negotiations. That's what Thex'ral would do. That's what protocol demanded. But Mira had never been good at following protocol. She looked at the captain, at the way his hands trembled in the air, at the way his horns caught the light, and she thought about the weight of her missing pistol, the way it used to sit against her hip like a promise. Then she stood, slow and deliberate, and walked towards him. The raider with the cracked visor swung his rifle towards her. "I said nobody moves." Mira stopped, her hands loose at her sides. "I'm not armed. I'm just standing." The raider hesitated. That was all she needed. She reached across Thex'ral's shoulders, her fingers closing around the base of his left horn. The captain made a strangled sound, surprise maybe, or protest, but Mira didn't stop. She twisted once, hard, and the horn snapped free with a crack like breaking stone. Thex'ral staggered, his hands flying to his head, and Mira was already moving. She grabbed the second horn, wrenched it loose, and turned towards the raiders with obsidian spirals in both hands. The bridge camera glitched, just for a second, just long enough for the footage to skip. When it stabilized, 3 raiders were already down.
The horns were heavier than they looked, dense, smooth, and perfectly balanced. Mira's grip tightened around the bases as she moved, her body falling into the rhythm she'd learned in a dozen forgotten combat drills. The first raider went down when she drove the pointed end of the left horn into the gap between his helmet and chestplate. The second fell when she swept his legs out from under him and slammed the right horn into his visor. The third tried to fire, but Mira was already inside his range, the horn cutting upward through the soft plating under his jaw. The bridge erupted into chaos. The raiders scattered, some firing wildly, others scrambling for cover behind the consoles. Mira didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her body moved on instinct, each strike deliberate and economical. She'd been trained to fight with knives, batons, improvised weapons, anything that could turn a disadvantage into an opening. The horns weren't so different. They were sharp, sturdy, and long enough to keep her out of grappling range. She drove forward, using the console as cover, and caught the next raider across the throat with a horizontal slash. He dropped, choking, and Mira pivoted, the horns spinning in her hands. Another raider came at her from the left, a plasma cutter hissing in his grip. She ducked under his swing, drove the right horn into his knee, and finished him with a strike to the side of his helmet. The bridge crew was screaming, not in fear, but in shock. Darren had thrown himself behind the communications panel, his hands over his head. The Savathi engineer was frozen at her station, her wide eyes tracking Mira's every move. The Thex'ral was still on his knees, his hands pressed to the stumps of his horns, his voice a low, keening sound that Mira tried not to hear. She couldn't think about him, not yet. 2 raiders broke towards the airlock, their weapons forgotten in their panic. Mira let them go. She turned instead to the cluster near the viewport, where the raider with the cracked visor was shouting orders. He was the leader. She could tell by the way the others deferred to him, by the way he kept his rifle trained on her even as his crew fell around him. "Back off," he shouted, his voice crackling. "Back off or I blow the hull." Mira stopped, her chest heaving. She didn't lower the horns. The raider gestured to one of his crew, a smaller figure with a jerry-rigged explosive strapped to his chest. "I'm not bluffing. You take one more step and we all go out into the void." Mira's jaw tightened. She believed him. Pirates like this, the ones who operate in the expanse, weren't soldiers. They were desperate, unstable, and willing to die if it meant taking their enemies with them. She glanced at the explosive, calculating the blast radius, the time it would take to detonate, the distance she'd need to close to disarm it. Too far. Too fast. She lowered the horns, just a fraction. "You don't want to do that." The raider laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think I care? We came here for cargo, for leverage, not for some psycho-diplomat." "I'm not a diplomat," Mira said quietly, "and you are not walking off this ship." The raider's finger twitched on the trigger. I saw it, the micro-movement, the shift in his stance, and she moved. She hurled the left horn like a spear, the obsidian spindle spinning through the air. It struck the raider's rifle, knocking it from his grip, and Mira was already closing the distance. She swung the right horn in a wide arc, catching the smaller raider across the chest before he could trigger the explosive. He went down hard, the explosive skittering across the deck. The raider with the cracked visor lunged for it, his hands scrabbling against the plating. Mira drove her boot into his ribs, kicked him away, and scooped up the explosive. She held it in one hand, her fingers steady, and looked at the remaining raiders. "Get off my bridge," she said.
They ran. The airlock cycled twice, and then the bridge was silent, except for the alarms and the soft, ragged breathing of the crew. Mira set the explosive down carefully, her hands shaking now that the adrenaline was fading. She turned to Thex'ral, who was still on his knees, his hands pressed to his head. "Captain," she said softly. He looked up at her, his amber eyes glassy with shock. Blood, dark and viscous, seeped through his fingers, staining the deck beneath him. The stumps of his horns were jagged, raw, and Mira felt a sharp twist of guilt in her chest. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't have a choice." Thex'ral's claws clicked once, weakly. "You used my horns." "Yes. They were sacred." Mira knelt beside him, her voice steady. "I know, and I'm sorry, but they kept you alive." Thex'ral stared at her for a long moment, his breathing shallow. Then he lowered his hands, revealing the stumps in full. They were still bleeding, but the flow was slowing. He touched one with a trembling claw, his expression unreadable. "You saved us,"
he said finally. Mira nodded. That's my job. You are an envoy. You have no weapons, no authority. I have what I need, Mira said. She stood, offering him a hand. He took it, all 4 hands gripping hers as she hauled him to his feet. He swayed, unsteady, and Mira steadied him with a hand on his shoulder. Darren emerged from behind a communications panel, his face pale. Is it over? For now, Mira said. She glanced at the airlock, at the scorch marks and debris scattered across the deck. But we need to get out of here before they regroup. The Saivathi engineer nodded, her hands already flying over the life support console. Engines are intact, hull breach is sealed. We can jump, but it'll be rough. Make it happen, Mira said. She turned to Thex'ral, who was still staring at his horns where they lay on the deck, dark and bloodied. Captain? He didn't answer. He just bent down, slow and deliberate, and picked up the horns. He held them in his upper hands, his claws trembling, and looked at Mira. They were a symbol, he said quietly, of my lineage, my honor. They still are, Mira said. They just saved 30 lives. Thex'ral's claws clicked once, soft and uncertain. Then he nodded.
The Kindred Prospect jumped 3 hours later, its hull groaning under the strain of an emergency FTL burn. Mira stayed on the bridge the entire time, her hands resting on the console as the stars stretched into lines of light. The crew moved around her in a careful dance, their voices low and their movements precise. No one looked at her directly. No one spoke to her unless necessary. She didn't blame them. What she'd done, the way she'd moved, the speed and brutality of it, wasn't something they could reconcile with the quiet envoy who'd spent 11 days making polite conversation over recycled tea. She'd shattered their sense of safety, their understanding of who she was, and she couldn't take that back. Thex'ral sat in his captain's chair, his horns resting in his lap. The stumps on his head had been sealed with a medical gel that the Saivathi engineer had applied with shaking hands. The gel glowed faintly in the dim light, a pale blue that matched the color of his blood. He hadn't spoken since they'd jumped. He just sat there, his upper hands cradling the horns, his lower hands gripping the armrests. Mira wanted to say something, to apologize again, to explain, but she didn't. Words felt hollow after what had happened, so she stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on the viewport, and waited. The jump lasted 6 hours. When they dropped back into normal space, the Coalition frigate Resolute Dawn was waiting for them, its hull bristling with weaponry and its running lights flashing in a pattern that meant, "Stand down." Darren established contact immediately, his voice tight with relief as he transmitted their identification codes and emergency status. The Resolute Dawn responded within minutes, dispatching a medical team and a security detail. The boarding ramp extended with a hiss, and a squad of Coalition Marines stepped onto the bridge. They moved with the kind of precision that came from years of training, their armor gleaming under the emergency lights, their rifles held at the ready. The lead Marine, a woman with a scar across her jaw and captain's bars on her shoulder, swept the bridge with her gaze, taking in the scorch marks, the blood, the debris. Her eyes landed on Mira, who was still standing at the console, her hands folded behind her back. "Envoy Solis?" the captain said. "That's me," Mira said. The captain's expression didn't change. "We received a priority alert from the Kindred Prospect. The report said you engaged 30 hostiles with improvised weapons and neutralized the threat in under a minute." Mira glanced at Darren, who shrugged helplessly. "I filed the report," he said. "I didn't know what else to do." The captain nodded slowly. "We need you to come with us, Envoy. There's going to be an inquiry." Mira's chest tightened. "An inquiry?" "Standard procedure," the captain said. "Any time a civilian engages in combat on a diplomatic vessel, we have to review the incident, make sure everything was by the book." "I wasn't carrying a weapon," Mira said. "I used what was available." "I know," the captain said. "But the footage—" She hesitated, her jaw tightening. "The footage is concerning." Mira didn't ask what she meant. She already knew. The bridge camera had glitched during the fight, skipping over key moments, but the parts that remained were enough to show what she was capable of, enough to raise questions. "I'll cooperate," Mira said. She looked at Thex'ral, who was still sitting in his chair, his horns in his lap. "What about the captain?"
He'll be taken to the medical bay for treatment, and then we'll need his statement as well." Thex'ral looked up at her, his amber eyes dull. "I will tell them what happened," he said quietly. "I will tell them you saved us." "Thank you," Mira said. She meant it. The Marines escorted her off the bridge, their hands light on her shoulders but firm enough to make it clear she wasn't in control. Mira didn't resist. She walked with them down the corridor, past the crew quarters in the common area, and onto the boarding ramp that led to the Resolute Dawn. The ramp was cold under her boots, the air sharp and metallic. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and stepped into the frigate's airlock. The inquiry lasted 3 days. They held it in a conference room on the Resolute Dawn, a sterile space with white walls and a long table that seated 12. Mira sat at one end, her hands folded on the table, and answered questions. Where had she trained? Why had she reacted so quickly? How had she known the horns would work as weapons? The questions came from a panel of 3 officers, 2 humans and a Korvathi delegate, and they asked them in careful, neutral tones that made Mira's skin prickle. She told them the truth. She'd been a peacekeeper in the outer colonies for 6 years, trained in close-quarters combat and improvised weapons. She'd left the service after a mission went wrong, after she'd lost her squad to a pirate ambush on a mining station near the fringe. She'd spent the last 2 years working as a civilian envoy, mediating disputes and observing treaty negotiations. She didn't carry a weapon anymore. She didn't need to. The panel listened, their faces unreadable. Then they played the footage. The bridge camera had captured most of the fight, despite the glitches. Mira watched herself move across the screen, her body a blur of motion, the horns spinning in her hands. She saw the raiders fall, one by one, their armor splitting under her strikes. She saw the way she moved, efficient, brutal, unstoppable, and she understood why the captain used the word concerning. She looked like a killer. When the footage ended, the Korvathi delegate leaned forward. "Envoy Solis," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You broke Captain Thex'ral's horns. In our culture, those horns are sacred. They represent his lineage, his honor. To remove them by force is an act of profound violence." Mira met his gaze. "I know. And yet you did it anyway." "Yes." "Why?" Mira's jaw tightened. "Because it was the only way to save him and everyone else on that bridge." The delegate's claws clicked once, twice. "You could have waited. You could have allowed the raiders to take what they wanted and leave." "They weren't going to leave," Mira said. "They were going to kill everyone. That's what pirates do." "You cannot know that." "I do know that," Mira said, her voice sharp. "I've seen it before. I've lost people to it. I wasn't going to let it happen again." The room fell silent. The human officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. The Korvathi delegate stared at Mira for a long moment, his amber eyes unblinking. "Captain Thex'ral has submitted a statement," he said finally. "He says you saved his life. He says you acted with honor, despite the violence." Mira's breath caught. "He said that?" "Yes." The delegate's claws clicked again. "He has also requested that you be allowed to keep his horns as a token of gratitude." Mira didn't know what to say. She just nodded, her throat tight. The inquiry ended with a formal reprimand, a note in her file that she'd acted outside of protocol, but that her actions had been justified under the circumstances. The panel dismissed her with a warning to avoid similar situations in the future, and Mira left the conference room feeling lighter than she had in days. Thex'ral was waiting for her in the corridor. He looked smaller without his horns, his head bare and vulnerable. The stumps had healed cleanly, leaving smooth, pale scars that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He held a small case in his upper hands, his lower hands folded across his chest. "Envoy Solis." "Captain," Mira said. She stopped in front of him, her hands at her sides. "I heard what you said, about the horns." Thex'ral nodded. "They are yours now. You gave them purpose." Mira took the case, her fingers trembling. She opened it, and there they were, the 2 obsidian spirals, polished and gleaming, the silver script still visible along their curves. They looked like art, like relics. "I don't know what to say," Mira said. "Say nothing," Thex'ral said. He clicked his claws once, soft and deliberate. "But know this, You gave me something I did not expect. You gave me a reason to trust again." Mira's throat tightened. "I'm sorry, I hurt you. You saved me. That is enough."
The Kindred Prospect was repaired over the next 2 weeks, its hull patched and its systems restored. Mira stayed aboard, helping where she could, and the crew slowly began to relax around her. Darren started making jokes again. The Savathi engineers stopped flinching every time Mira walked past, and Thex'ral spent his mornings in the observation deck, staring out at the stars. Mira found him there one morning, his hands resting on the viewport's railing, his head tilted in thought. She approached quietly, the case with his horns tucked under her arm. "Captain," she said. Thex'ral turned, his expression calm. "Envoy, you are well?" "I am," Mira said. She set the case on the railing, her fingers resting on the lid. "I wanted to talk to you about what happened." Thex'ral's claws clicked once. "There is nothing to say. You acted. We survived." "I broke your horns," Mira said. "I took something sacred from you. I need to know if you can forgive me for that." Thex'ral was silent for a long moment. Then he reached out, his upper hand resting on the case. "In my culture," he said slowly, "horns are a symbol of honor, of lineage. They are passed down through generations, carved with the names of our ancestors. To lose them is to lose a part of oneself." Mira's chest tightened. "I know." "But," Thex'ral continued, his voice soft, "they are also a symbol of purpose, and you gave them a purpose I could never have imagined." He tapped the case with one claw. "These horns saved lives. They became something greater than tradition, greater than honor." Mira's breath hitched. "You're not angry?" "I was, at first, but anger is a hollow thing. It does not heal. It does not build." He looked at her, his amber eyes steady. "You gave me a gift, Envoy Solis. You reminded me that survival is more important than symbols, that kindness, even violent kindness, is a form of love." Mira didn't know what to say. She just nodded, her eyes burning. Thex'ral smiled, a small, tentative thing. "Besides," he said, "I have already commissioned new horns. They will be carved with a new symbol, a symbol of the human who saved my life." Mira laughed, a short, surprised sound. "You're going to carve me into your horns?" "Why not?" Thex'ral said. "You are part of my story now, and my story is worth telling." The Kindred Prospect resumed its journey to the Vena Force summit 3 days later. The crew moved with a new confidence, their voices lighter, their movements sharper. Mira noticed the change, the way Darren held his head a little higher, the way the Savathi engineer hummed while she worked. They'd been tested, and they'd survived. That counted for something. The summit itself was a blur of meetings and negotiations, a week-long event held in a towering crystalline structure that overlooked a turquoise sea. Mira sat through most of it in silence, her role as an observer limiting her participation. But she noticed the way the other delegates looked at her, the sidelong glances, the whispered conversations. Word had spread about what happened on the Kindred Prospect, about the human envoy who'd used a captain's horns to gut a pirate fleet. She didn't try to correct them. She just sat, quiet and still, and watched. On the final day of the summit, Thex'ral gave a speech. He stood at the center of the assembly hall, his new horns gleaming under the lights. They were shorter than the old ones, carved from pale bone instead of obsidian, and the silver script along their curves told a new story. Mira couldn't read the script from where she sat, but she saw the way Thex'ral touched them, reverent and proud. "We are gathered here," Thex'ral said, his voice carrying across the hall, "to discuss trade routes and treaties, to build bridges between our peoples. But I want to tell you a different story, a story about what it means to trust, to sacrifice, to survive." He gestured to Mira, who sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap. "Envoy Solis saved my life. She took something sacred from me, my horns, my honor, and she used them to protect my crew. She did not ask permission, she did not hesitate, she acted. The hall was silent. Mira's chest tightened. And in so doing, she taught me something I had forgotten, that honor is not a symbol, it is a choice. It is the willingness to sacrifice, to fight, to protect. Envoy Solis chose to protect us, and I will carry that choice with me for the rest of my life. He bowed, his new horns catching the light, and the hall erupted in applause. Mira sat there stunned as the delegates stood and clapped. She felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them away. She didn't deserve this, she'd just done what needed to be done. But when Thex'ral looked at her, his amber eyes warm and steady, she realized that maybe, just maybe, that was enough.
The journey back to Luna 9 took 12 days. Mira spent most of it in the observation deck, the case with Thex'ral's horns resting on the table beside her. She'd open it sometimes, running her fingers along the obsidian spirals, tracing the silver script. She couldn't read the words, but she felt their weight, their meaning. Darren found her there one evening, a cup of tea in his hands. "Mind if I sit?" "Go ahead," Mira said. He settled into the chair across from her, his gaze drifting to the case. "You ever think about what you did? On the bridge, I mean." Mira didn't answer right away. She just stared out at the stars, her hands wrapped around her own cup. "Every day," she said finally. "Regret it?" "No," Mira said, "but I think about it, what it cost, what it means." Darren nodded. "You saved us. You know that, right?" "I know," Mira said, "but it doesn't change what I am." "What you are?" Darren frowned. "You're a hero." Mira laughed, a bitter sound. "I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who's seen too much, who's lost too much." She looked at him, her eyes hard. "I didn't save you because I'm brave. I saved you because I couldn't stand to lose anyone else." Darren was quiet for a long moment. Then he set his cup down, his expression serious. "You know what I think? I think you're braver than you give yourself credit for. Because you didn't have to do what you did. You could have stayed quiet, let the pirates take what they wanted. But you didn't. You chose to fight. And that's not weakness, that's strength." Mira's throat tightened. She wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the words wouldn't come. So she just nodded, her hands trembling around her cup. When they docked at Luna 9, Mira was the last one off the ship. She stood at the airlock, her bag slung over her shoulder, the case with Thex'ral's horns tucked under her arm. Thex'ral met her there, his new horns gleaming under the station's lights. "Envoy Solis," he said. "Captain," Mira said. She held out the case. "I wanted to thank you for everything." Thex'ral shook his head, his claws clicking. "The horns are yours. They will always be yours." "I don't know if I can carry them," Mira said quietly. "They're too heavy." "Then carry them together," Thex'ral said. He placed one of his upper hands on her shoulder, his grip firm and steady. "With the memory of what we survived, with the knowledge that you are not alone." Mira's eyes burned. She blinked hard and nodded. "Thank you." Thex'ral smiled. "Thank you, Envoy, for reminding me what it means to be strong." Mira left the station that night, the case with Thex'ral's horns strapped to her pack. She walked through the crowded terminal, past the vendors and the travelers, and stepped onto the transport shuttle that would take her back to Earth. The shuttle was small and cramped, the seats worn and the air stale, but Mira didn't mind. She settled into her seat, the case resting on her lap, and closed her eyes. She thought about Thex'ral, about the way he'd touched his new horns with reverence and pride. She thought about Darren, about the way he'd called her a hero. She thought about the raiders, about the way they'd scattered when she'd turned the captain's horns into weapons. And she thought about the weight of those horns, the weight of what she'd done, what she'd become. She didn't have the answers. She didn't know if she ever would. But as the shuttle lifted off, the stars stretching into lines of light,
Mira felt something shift in her chest, something lighter, something like hope. She opened the case one last time, her fingers tracing the obsidian spirals. The silver script gleamed under the shuttle's dim lights, and Mira whispered the words she couldn't read, a prayer to the ancestors she didn't know. "Thank you," she said, "for giving me a reason to fight." The shuttle jumped, and the stars disappeared into the void. 6 months later, Mira stood in a small auditorium on Earth, her hands resting on a podium. The room was filled with peacekeepers and envoys, their faces turned towards her, their expressions expectant. She'd been asked to give a talk about her experience on the Kindred Prospect, about the lessons she'd learned, the choices she'd made. She'd almost said no, but then she'd opened the case with Thex'ral's horns, and she'd remembered what he'd told her, that honor is a choice, that survival is more important than symbols. So she said yes. Now, standing at the podium, Mira took a deep breath and began. "They told me no weapons on the bridge," Mira said. "So I used what I had. I used the captain's horns. I used my training. I used my fear." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. "And I survived. We all survived." The audience was silent. "I don't tell you this story to glorify violence. I tell you this story to remind you that survival is a choice, that honor is a choice, that every day we choose who we want to be, and sometimes those choices are messy, brutal, imperfect." She reached into her bag and pulled out one of the horns, holding it up for the audience to see. The obsidian spirals gleamed under the lights, the silver script catching the glow. "This horn belonged to Captain Thex'ral," she said. "It was a symbol of his lineage, his honor, and I took it from him. I broke it. I used it." She lowered the horn, her hand steady. "But in doing so, I gave it a new purpose, a new meaning. And that's what I want you to remember, that our symbols, our weapons, our choices are only as powerful as the purpose we give them." The audience erupted in applause. Mira stood there, the horn in her hands, and smiled. Later that evening, she returned to her apartment, a small, cluttered space on the edge of the city. She set the case with the horns on the table next to a photograph of her old squad and stared at it for a long moment. Then she opened her terminal and sent a message to Thex'ral. "Captain, I gave the talk today. I told them about the horns, about what you taught me. I think they understood. Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not alone. Mira." The reply came an hour later. "Envoy Solis, I am glad you spoke. Your story is worth telling, and your strength is worth remembering. Safe travels, my friend. Thex'ral." Mira read the message twice, then closed the terminal. She looked at the horns, at the photograph, at the quiet space around her, and for the first time in a long time, she felt at peace.